The first knock sounded like a mistake, soft, apologetic, almost shy. The second was deliberate, the kind that insists on being heard. By the third, Nico's heartbeat had already climbed into his throat because some instinct, some old bruise, knew exactly who it was even before he opened the door. Lena stood on the porch, her hair damp from an early fog, hand trembling around the strap of a canvas bag. She was the kind of beautiful that got away with cruelty in small doses, the kind that once made Nico forgive her faster than his wounds could scar. They hadn't spoken in 19 months, not since the night he'd left the keys on the counter and walked into the rain without looking back. "Nico," she said, voice barely more than breath. "Please." Every muscle in him wanted to shut the door, to lean his whole weight into it and let the wood take the force of her presence. He expected anger to come easy. Anger had always been the faithful dog, but what came instead was a cold, precise clarity. No more fires, no more begging, no more little deaths. "It's Sunday," he said carefully, "and you're not on the guest list." She swallowed. "I know I shouldn't be here. I followed you from your dad's house. I remembered Sundays. Please, just 5 minutes." He hated that he recognized the tremor at the edge of her words, the tremor that used to draw him across rooms like a tide. He stepped aside. He told himself it was for closure. He told himself he wasn't weak, just final. "Make it 3, he said. She didn't sit. The living room was still in that transitional state of new beginnings, sanded floors, pale light, 2 plants trying to forgive the window for not being south-facing. Boxes lined the wall with tidy labels, kitchen, office, past, and it made Lena smile for a breath. You could tell a lot about someone by how they moved in a new space. She stood like she was afraid it might reject her. "Coffee?" she asked, glancing toward the kitchen, like there might be a world where she could pretend to belong there again. "You're not a guest," he said quietly. "Say what you came to say." Her eyes flicked up to his, and he felt the old gravity, every good memory gathering like magnets in the room, trying to pull him out of his shape. "I never stopped loving you." "There it is," he said, and the words tasted metallic. "Right on schedule." The canvas bag slid a little on her shoulder. She caught it clumsily. "I made a mistake." "You made a pattern," he corrected. "Don't insult us both." The presence that haunted their marriage had a name: Joss. He was a musician when it was convenient, a myth when it wasn't, the storm that followed summer in their house. Joss had been her first love, her first everything, and he never really left. He just receded like a tide, leaving his claims glowing faint beneath the surface until he wanted to watch them burn again. Every time he returned, Lena slipped like a hand into an old pocket, and Nico, good soldier, learned new ways to stand alone beside her. He clung to the discipline he'd taught himself in the aftermath. Breathe, tell your body it's safe, keep your feet grounded. He almost missed it when she said, very softly, "I didn't know where else to go." "The police are for emergencies," he said. "The church is for forgiveness. I'm not running either at the moment." A small, bitter smile crossed her face. "You're still cruel when you're trying to be kind." "Only to history." The silence was bone-white. He watched her scan the room again, as if searching for proof that he'd made a life without her, as if the evidence might yet call her a liar. Her hand tightened around the strap of the bag until her knuckles went white. "I'm pregnant," she said. The word didn't fit in the room at first. It hovered, casting a strange shadow over everything familiar. He became suddenly aware of details, the way the floorboard under the far window curved, the faint scent of lemon oil, the ghost of rain in her hair. He remembered all the times they had tried and failed, and the way their failures hollowed the space between them until even the light looked thin. "And," he said, because he had become a man who required structure for disasters, "it's yours." Her voice cracked on the last word like a bridge that wasn't meant to carry that weight. He laughed. It wasn't a kind sound. "You've rehearsed that sentence before, on bad nights." On his porch. "I didn't know," she said quickly, as if speed could make it true. "Not until after you left. I was late and I thought it was stress, and then, by the time I took the test, you were gone and she broke off, jaw flexing. Joss, he supplied, because if they were going to haul their old ghosts out, they might as well name them. She nodded. He said it wasn't his problem. He said he'd never been good at ghosts, just at turning up when the music demanded it. He left, he always leaves. But this time there's a heartbeat. Nico's throat ached. He didn't trust that ache. Ache could be staged. Ache could be weaponized. He had learned that the hard way. He had learned it in the small hours when the house had felt like a courtroom, and he never got to be the judge. He could make mistakes again, he realized. He could open the door and let the fire back in. He could become his own undoing in chapters, or he could be the man he had been learning to be since the night he walked away. "What's on the birth certificate?" he asked. She flinched. The answer was written in the set of her mouth. "No one, not yet." "I haven't," her hand ghosted over her belly, an involuntary tenderness that felt like a punch to watch. "I didn't want to do it wrong. And when were you going to tell me?" The calm in his voice surprised him. "I tried," she said. "I wrote letters. I drove past twice a week for a month. Her face broke open then, and it was not pretty. Lena crying had never been pretty, not dramatic or photogenic. It was raw, snotty, the way grief looks when it's told the truth. He resented his body for remembering how to reach for her. He did not step forward. He did not save her from the consequences of her own mouth. He'd done that enough for 10 lives. "Maya's coming," he said instead, because there were other truths in the room, brighter ones. He tasted the word like warmth. Any minute. Lena sucked in a breath. The name settled between them like a line. Maya, who loved like a steady river, who listened like a profession, who came into Nico's life when all the doors had been taken off the hinges and helped him build something you could sleep inside of. Maya, with her laugh that found the secret handle on the heaviest days. Maya, who had taught him that trust was not a performance but a practice. Maya, who was 8 weeks from their daughter's due date, who called the baby bow while they painted a grove of trees on the nursery wall in the friendliest green they could find. As if summoned, the key turned in the lock, the door swung open, and Maya stepped inside with a grocery bag hooked on one finger and a paper tray balancing 2 lidded cups. Her hair was pulled into a loose knot, dark eyes bright with the chill morning, that smile already forming like a promise. Then she saw Lena. The smile didn't shatter, it receded. Maya's face did not harden so much as still, like a lake under a pause in the wind. She set the coffees on the hall table without looking away. "Hello," she said, voice soft as worn velvet. "You must be Lena." Lena's mouth tightened, pride jolting her posture. She nodded once, brisk enough to be mistaken for one of those polite head-dip strangers exchange at elevators. "Maya." The 2 names felt like endpoints of a line that had been waiting to be drawn. Nico's chest squeezed. For a small, dangerous second, he wanted to run. Instead, he walked to Maya, took the bag from her hand and touched her wrist, a question. She slid her fingers through his, answer and anchor. "What's going on?" she asked him, eyes flicking back to Lena's measureless expression. "An old fire drill," he said lightly, and he heard himself sounding like someone who was okay. "With a new variable." Lena gave a rough laugh. "That's what I am to you, a variable." He almost said something cruel. He didn't. He looked at Maya, at the steady weight of her regard, at the way her presence kept the air sweet. "We'll talk," he said to Lena, choosing the discipline that had saved him. "But whatever this is, it will happen here with light on it. No lies, no closed doors. And I need you to understand that this is not a house you get to burn." Lena stared at his hand in Maya's. She swallowed, that tremor back in her throat old as they were. "Please," she whispered, "just hear me." Maya nodded. "We can hear you," she said, "but we can't go back." Lena pressed her lips together and exhaled. When she spoke again, it was quieter than the room. "I'm not asking you to go back," she said. "I'm asking you to help me move forward." Nico felt the ground shift. Some part of him, the part that had always assumed the script would demand the same ending, stilled. He didn't believe her. He wanted to. He was tired of not believing. "Okay," he said. "Start there." Lena pulled a folded envelope from her canvas bag and held it out with 2 fingers. "I went to the clinic on Thursday. It's a proof of heartbeat. And a letter from Dr. Falco if you..." she stopped, eyes bright, embarrassed suddenly by her own effort. Maya took the envelope and opened it with a careful neatness that made Lena exhale like someone had just handed her a coat. They read in the doorway light, the three of them gathered around the thin page like a ritual. There it was, that small rhythm in black and white, the suggestion of a small person's insistence. If hope had a shape, it might look like this, a measure of sound that said there was more future than past. Nico closed his eyes. When he opened them, he was not yet a father to the idea, but he was not one either. He could feel the edges of the decision pulsing, feel how easily it could be corrupted by nostalgia or softened by guilt. He looked again at Maya, who, even now, was not a wall but a window. "We're not going to lie to ourselves," he said to both of them. "Not this time." Lena nodded. "I don't want your pity," she said. "I want your honesty." "Honesty has consequences," Maya said gently. "I know," Lena replied, and for the first time since she walked in, she sounded like someone who had learned a language the hard way. "I'm here for them." A siren wailed faint on some far street, bright and distant. In the nursery down the hall, the paint had dried to a soft matte, and the trees on the wall looked like they were listening. "Sit," Maya said finally, motioning toward the couch. "Let's decide what we have power over and what we don't." Lena hesitated, then sat at the edge, both hands on her knees like a student about to be tested. Nico lowered himself into the chair opposite, Maya to his right on the armrest, one hand anchoring on his shoulder. The triangle they formed felt precarious and exact. This was not forgiveness. This was not forgetting. This was the first step of something that wouldn't fit into old rooms. "Tell us everything," Nico said, and Lena did. Some truths arrive like medicine, bitter, necessary, meant to heal something that won't cure by itself. Others arrive like weather. The week after Lena's visit, the city wore gray like a shawl. The river ran fat and sullen, and the neighborhood dogs barked at nothing as if they could sense a pressure drop in their people. Sleep, when it came, delivered odd dreams. Nico wandering through rooms with no doors. Maya counting tiny socks that kept multiplying like mercy. Lena at the foot of a stairwell, one hand on the rail, the other pressed to a belly as if to steady a promise. They set rules. They bought a small, leather-bound notebook for everything we're not allowed to forget, and Maya wrote in her clean print on the first page, no closed-door conversations, no secrecy, no decisions without all three, no weaponized memory, no saving anyone from themselves. It looked like a treaty, like the kind nations sign after too much blood. It made room out of chaos. It let their days have shape. Lena came by on Wednesdays in daylight. She parked across the street so it wouldn't feel like she lived there. The first Wednesday, she held the paper cup with both hands as if coffee might decide to leap out if she forgot to be careful. She didn't reach for Nico. She didn't pretend to forget the line she'd crossed and couldn't ever uncross. She sat up straight, cataloged her symptoms with a new seriousness. Nausea, yes, backache sometimes, dreams where her mother was young and kind and then not. She had a list of questions, circled and starred, and when Maya answered, Lena took notes like answers were a job she could do well enough to earn a different kind of life. The question Lena didn't ask hung between all their words. What if it's not his? It was a living question, the kind they fed with restraint and water and no sudden movements. They agreed to a prenatal paternity test at 10 weeks. They agreed to take turns holding the hope and the skepticism so no one's arms got tired. They agreed to tell the truth even if it was ugly. They agreed that ugly truths were better than beautiful pretenses. What if we're making an ark for a storm that never arrives? Nico asked late that first Wednesday, after Lena left, after the dishes were done and the house had relaxed into the sound of the refrigerator. "Then we learn carpentry," Maya said, a smile balancing on the rim of her voice. "It won't hurt us to get better at building." He loved her for her precise ease, for the way she never minimized the weight and yet never demanded that he collapse under it. Loving Maya made him feel like breathing was something his body could be trusted with. Still, the nights put their hands on his chest. He would wake at 2 with a taste in his mouth like rust and memory, the house too quiet, the world too dark, his mind staging plays he did not audition for. He would see himself 3 years ago in the old kitchen, Lena laughing in the doorway, Joss's shadow long on the floor. He would feel again the humiliation of not being chosen, the indignity of love turned into a democracy where he always lost the vote. He would feel again the rain on his neck from that last night, the key heavy in his palm before he set it down atop the note that said only enough. Maya didn't try to talk him out of the ghosts. She'd lie there beside him in the cast of streetlight on their sheets, eyes open, hands laced over her belly, and sometimes she'd tell him quiet stories of her childhood to wash his mind. Stories about her grandmother's kitchen where cardamom lived in a blue jar, about the time she learned to braid her cousin's hair on the bus because the morning had been late, about the old landlord who sang to the radiator every November to keep it from complaining. She knew that grief didn't want answers, it wanted company. The second Wednesday, Lena brought an apology that didn't dress itself up. It wasn't tied with explanations. It didn't ask for immediate absolution like a tip. It sat on the table between them, plain and unlovely, and she let them examine it. "I have spent years believing I was the victim of my own hunger," Lena said. "As if I was being dragged by something I couldn't control instead of following it because it felt like a god. I used Joss to feel alive when I was bored and you to feel safe when I was scared. I am ashamed. I know that doesn't fix anything. Shame is easy," Maya said gently. "Repair is not." "I want repair," Lena said, and the room believed her a little, not because she sounded holy but because she didn't. They mapped logistics. If the test said yes, there would be paperwork, agreements, a schedule that respected all the lives in play. If the test said no, there would be a different kind of mercy, one that didn't detour through pretending. Maya insisted on a therapist, a neutral harbor, who would hold the heavy and pass the tissues and call out lies even if they arrived in beautiful dresses. "Why are you helping me?" Lena asked, exhaustion softening her face into something younger. "I burned your future once without even touching it." "Because I'm in love with him," Maya said simply, and Nico felt the words like a warm towel across his chest. "And because children are not currency to barter for forgiveness. And because my daughter will inherit whatever weather we make now." Lena nodded, eyes wet, not with performance but with the specific kind of relief that comes when someone speaks in a language you didn't know you knew. They were, all of them, learning a grammar of boundaries. It was a language with its own tenses. I loved, I love, I will not. It had pronouns that required care. It had a word for no that meant both not now and not ever, depending on how it was held. It had a word for yes that meant I will show up with my whole self and not leave the messy parts on the porch. On the third Wednesday, rain came down like someone upstairs had tipped a basin. Lena arrived pale and breathless, eyes brighter than they should have been, lips chapped from chewing. "It's time," she said, voice too calm to be safe. They didn't panic. Panic is loud and fragile. They had made a practice of quiet strength. Maya had the hospital bag by the door because readiness was her love language, and Nico grabbed the notebook and the insurance card folder. "See," he thought distantly, as if narrating to a future self, "look how we are already better than we were." At the hospital, the fluorescent lights made even the brave look wan. The triage nurse looked over the chart and raised one professional eyebrow at the week's count. 32, she asked, and Lena nodded, not as brave as she'd meant to be. "Could be Braxton Hicks," the nurse said briskly. "Could be the real thing, we'll check." They checked. It was the real thing, softened by meds and measured by monitors that ticked out the wild wisdom of a small heart and a body doing a job older than history. The doctor, a woman with calm hands and marathon runner calves, said, "We're going to try to keep him in the penthouse a little longer," and the room laughed because you laugh when doctors decorate fear. Hours stretched and softened. Maya dozed in a chair shaped for pretending to sleep, one hand on her own belly like a promise ring. Nico stood and sat and stood and counted and recounted the seconds between Lena's breaths. They were weirdly good at this together, the three of them. Strange, he thought, that emergency could make them look like a team. When the contraction hit hard enough to crack Lena's composure, she reached blindly for a hand, any hand, because pain doesn't do pedigree. Nico gave her his. She squeezed like a person falling off a building, and he let her, old calluses waking up to serve a new purpose. Afterward, she blinked at him like she'd forgotten whose fingers she'd been breaking. "I'm sorry," she said. "For what?" he asked, and meant it. "For all of it," she whispered, and some stupid part of him wanted to say it's okay, and other parts wrestled that part to the ground. "It's not okay," he said. "But we're here." That felt like a better promise. The labor stalled around midnight, enough to worry the doctor, not enough to terrify her. They started a drip to rouse the uterus into a more cooperative mood, and the monitors resumed their patient song. In the dull stretch of 2 a.m., the world's soft underbelly hour, the door cracked and a nurse leaned in with a clipboard. "Quick question," she said, cheerful in that competent way that makes you want to trust her with your bones. "Paternity testing, still going ahead with the NIPP? If so, I've got the consent forms." The word slotted into the room like a blade. Lena's eyes went huge, animal-wide. She looked at Nico and then at Maya and then at some point in the air where resignation sat like a failing light. "Do we really have to do this now?" she asked, and the plea was not theatrical, not strategic. It was the plea of a person whose body was already doing too many jobs. Maya stood, slow and deliberate, and took the clipboard. "We do it when it's right," she said, voice balanced like a scale. She looked at Nico, question open as a palm. He thought of the notebook. He thought of the rules. He thought of the ways he had been undone by secrecy, by delay, by hoping tomorrows would be kinder than today. He thought of their baby girl's room, of trees on the wall, of the way they had promised not to teach their child love that makes you small. He nodded. "We do it now," he said, and felt simultaneously cruel and correct. Lena closed her eyes. When she opened them, they were not pleading anymore. "Okay," she said. "Okay." They signed. The nurse smiled like a person delivering mail. The machines kept up their monologue. Lena gripped the rails and breathed like the world depended on it, which, for one small world, it did. At 3:11 a.m., the monitors hiccuped into a rhythm that made the doctor's eyebrows knit. At 3:14, someone said the word decel. At 3:17, the room filled in that quiet, efficient way rooms do when urgency has to be caught midair. At 3:20, the doctor said, "We're going to move. Now," and the bed was rolling and strange ceilings were passing over them, and someone pressed warm blankets to Lena's legs like a blessing. "Tell me it's going to be okay," Lena gasped, not to be comforted but to have her fear witnessed. "We're going to do everything," the doctor said, which was the only honest promise, and somehow it was enough to get them to the next hallway, and then the next. At 3:28, a baby cried in another room, and it felt like foreshadowing. At 3:31, they pushed through doors and the lights bit down hard and the air tasted like metal and purpose. "Go," Maya told Nico, and he realized he'd been hesitating, as if he wasn't allowed into certain rooms. She pressed his hand once, hard enough to send a message across the skin. "Be where you need to be," she said. "There's no math here where love runs out." He went. If life is a string of doors, that night they walked through one they didn't know the shape of until it opened. The last thing he saw before the OR doors breathed shut was Maya standing very straight in a borrowed blue gown, her hands spread over the life inside her, her eyes steady as weathered wood. He thought, this is what a harbor looks like. He thought, whatever the test says, we will not be people who hide. In the bright, cold room, someone said, "Ready," and someone else said, "Ready," and Lena held Nico's gaze like a rope, and he gave her back everything he had that wasn't terror. "I'm here," he said. "I'm here." He was. Some mornings are born in hush. The day after, the hospital woke slowly, machines blinking into attention, carts murmuring down linoleum. Rain polished the windows. The river, visible between two brick buildings, looked like a strip of unwound steel. In recovery, Lena slept with her mouth slightly open, hair matted to her forehead in damp medallions, a tiny tremor working along her left hand, even as her body surrendered to the narcotic rest it had earned. Nico stood at the bassinet and looked down at the small, furious miracle they had been given permission to love. The nurse had announced him hours earlier with a flourish. 5 pounds, 11 ounces, lungs like a brass section. He was longer than he had a right to be, his skin painted in the particular rosy beige of new humans, his hair the indecisive dark that might go anywhere. He wore a hat too big for his head, which gave him the air of a small botanist forced to attend a gala. "Hi," Nico said, voice breaking into a register he didn't know it could inhabit. "You made a lot of trouble for yourself arriving early. Very on brand for this family." The baby yawned, and the world rearranged itself around the gesture. Maya slid into the room like Grace wearing sneakers. There were smudges under her eyes and the soft stubbornness of someone who'd stayed up through the worst part of the storm. She bent over the bassinet and smiled in a way that made Nico's ribs loosen. "He looks like a person who thinks everything should be on time," she said. "He looks like he'll file complaints," Nico agreed, and they laughed softly, reverent of the sleeping weft of the room. Lena stirred, woke, focused. The sequence felt like a ritual, an old one their bodies already knew. Her gaze found the bassinet like a compass needle. Her face underwent the kind of change that scares you with how fast it can transform a person. Fear cracked and something else shone through, something clean and bright and, yes, a little desperate. "Is he?" "He is," Maya said. "He's okay." Lena pressed the heel of her hand to her eyes. "I'm sorry," she said, and even now she was trying to pay debts with currency she didn't possess. Maya's voice softened. "Don't apologize for surviving," she said. "Just rest." They took turns holding him. Lena cried without apology, and when the nurse suggested skin to skin, she nodded like someone being handed both instruction and absolution. Nico watched her loosen something in her shoulders he hadn't seen loosen in years. He felt a tug in his own chest like a thread being pulled through fabric. Later, when the baby slept and the machines made their small indoor weather, a tech with gentle hands and braided hair came with a small kit and a quiet manner. "Test," she said softly. The word fell without echo. They had already walked toward it. Lena nodded, face calm in that way that grief can mimic. The tech swabbed the inside of the baby's cheek with all the reverence of a priest. She labeled and sealed and made a note on a clipboard that would outlive any of them. 3 to 5 business days, she said, which made Nico want to laugh, because how did the language of shipping inserts get to be in charge of fate? 3 to 5 eternities, Maya said afterward, wry, and they all smiled like people do when they're choosing to be on the same side of a joke. Waiting is a spiritual discipline. They practiced it like amateurs, awkward, clumsy, a little too showy. They went home after the second night because nurses had their own version of kindness, and one of them said gently to Nico, "You can't save anyone by not sleeping." The house felt different, as if a new room had been stapled onto it that they couldn't get into yet. The nursery's painted trees looked taller, the crib more like a thesis. Maya moved through the rooms with a hand on the small of her back. Nico followed with the notebook, writing down things that felt important in case songs were made out of them later. "It could be yes," Maya said as she fluffed a tiny stack of washcloth that hadn't asked to be pressed into service for something so ambitious as a human life. "It could be no. We will still be us either way." "I know," Nico said, and tried to mean it in a way that would hold under weight. In the evening, when the hour made everything honest, he said what worried him most. "I'm afraid that if it's yes, some old machinery in me will wake up and run the house. The machinery that thinks sacrifice is love, that thinks exhaustion is loyalty." Maya came close and put her hands on his face like it was a hinge that needed adjusting. "Then we unplug the old machinery," she said. "And if it fights us, we hire an electrician." He laughed into her palms, relief making a small, silly sound in his throat. "I don't want you to be brave for me," he said. "I'm being brave for our daughter," she answered. "And for the boy in the hospital who's going to need adults who don't lie. And for the woman who burned everything down and is now standing in the ashes asking for a cup of water. Courage isn't a possession, it's a practice." On day 3, a text. A number Nico didn't recognize, though he'd seen it scrawled on the clinic intake form. "Results are in. Call when ready. He stared at the dots on the screen like they were stars in a constellation he'd been told he could read if he squinted. He didn't call immediately. He found Maya in the nursery, the two of them squeezed into the rocker like kids hiding in a box fort. "I have the number," he said. "I don't know what to want." "Want truth," she said. "We'll want everything else later." He put the phone on speaker. The world contracted around a ring that sounded like a bad television idea. A woman on the other end finally, professional and kind, said two names and a date, and then the numbers that would turn into a story. The language felt clinical, probabilities and confidence intervals and results consistent with paternity. The conclusion was simple enough to fit into a sentence that fit into a breath. It was his. The relief did not arrive the way the movies arrange it. It wasn't a flood, it wasn't a choir. It was a slow, solid settling, like a book finding its place on a shelf it had been measured for. There was fear braided into it, and a kind of incredulous joy, and an unexpected tenderness for the version of himself who would have loved this child even if the math had gone the other way. Maya's hand squeezed his. She didn't say congratulations. She didn't say I'm sorry. She said, "Okay," in the tone of someone meeting a long-awaited guest on the porch. "Okay," he said. They went back to the hospital with flowers that looked like sunlight had been bottled and poured into petals. Lena's face cracked open when she saw them. There was a relief in her too, but not because of the story she could now tell about herself. Because it anchored the child to a person she believed could be steady. "I don't deserve," she started, and Maya put a finger up like a conductor calling for rest. "Deserve is a bad frame," Maya said, not unkind. "This is a story about stewardship. Let's decide how to share this human so he never learns love is a contest." They named him after day 4, because babies need names to hold onto when the world starts making demands. "Arlo," Lena said first, and it felt like a chord that settled. "Arlo," Nico repeated, and it stuck to his tongue nicely, a small bird of a word, a syllable a kid could slam into a wall happily. "Arlo," Maya said, and it fit into the harmony they were making like it had been composed for them. They took photos, the good kind where no one is performing and everyone looks like they're in on an inside joke. In one, Lena is crying laughing and Arlo is yawning, and Maya is looking at Nico like he might trip over his own joy, and she is ready to catch him. In another, Nico is holding Arlo with that mixture of awe and terror particular to new parents, and Lena is watching like she is memorizing how to feel something that won't leave. The paperwork began its endless series of boxes: birth certificate, acknowledgement of paternity, parenting plan draft. The law, which can be cold, has its tender moments when it imagines futures and tries to help people walk toward them without breaking their knees. They met with a mediator who had salt-white hair and a laugh that made people tell the truth by accident. They traced schedules onto calendars as if their lives were maps that could be crossed without blisters. "What about overnights?" the mediator asked. "Not for a while," Maya said, and Lena nodded, relief and sadness wrestling in her eyes. "We will build up to them on purpose." They spoke about holidays and doctor's appointments, and who would teach Arlo the family recipes, and who would sit in bleachers in cold months under terrible stadium lights. They talked about introducing him to Maya and Nico's daughter when she arrived, about making sure that each child learned the word sibling the way it should be learned, without an asterisk. When they left the office, the air smelled like rain and library books, and a neon sign across the street flickered the word open as if to endorse their project. At home that evening, Nico stood in the doorway of the nursery and watched Maya tape up a paper moon above the crib. She moved her body like it was two people, herself and their daughter, and it made him feel like a witness to a magic show where the trick was real. The trees on the wall looked less like paint and more like an intention. "We're going to be okay," he said, like a question. Maya stepped back to consider the moon's angle. "We're going to be honest," she said. "Okay is a byproduct." He came up behind her, slid his hands to her belly, felt the small roll that might have been a foot or a fist or a hello. He thought of Arlo's yawn. He thought of Lena's apology that didn't ask for absolution as a tip at the end. He thought of the machinery they were unplugging. He thought of the notebook on the coffee table with its rules like bones under skin. "Want to feel her?" Maya asked. He did. He knelt, pressed his ear to the roundness, and spoke like a conspirator. "Bo, there's a boy named Arlo who's going to try to teach you to shout, and we might have to pretend we disapprove." Maya laughed, low and rolled. "She kicked," she said. "She's in on the joke." Outside, a car went by playing a song that had been popular the summer before everything fell apart. He felt the ache arrive, then pass through him like weather. He was better at that now, letting things move without offering them a room. He looked up at Maya and said, "Thank you, because gratitude is a ritual that feeds itself." "For what?" she asked. "For every time you chose me over your story about yourself," he said, and watched her eyes warm. "Let's get some sleep," she said, a hope they both knew was foolish and still precious. "We're collecting it in jars." They went to bed with the door to the nursery open, because the quiet felt less like emptiness and more like the sound of a room taking deep breaths. The morning Arlo came home, the city decided to be kind. Light held itself carefully on the windowsill. A neighbor left a basket on the stoop with muffins shaped like hope, and a note that said in crooked block letters, "Welcome, small friend." Even the cat who ruled the block with a velvet paw decided to sit on the hood of their car as if blessing their travels. Lena stood in the doorway with the baby, nerves humming like a raw nerve strummed. She wore the look of a person holding something both fragile and eternal, and Nico felt the improbable tenderness that rises when life chooses mercy despite poor odds. Maya adjusted the car seat straps with an engineer's precision and the softness of someone calibrating a cradle. "Do we have the everything?" Lena asked, panic brightening around the edges of her words. "We have 3 kinds of diapers, 6 kinds of wipes, and 12 kinds of good intentions," Maya said. "We'll buy whatever else we forgot." She placed a hand on Lena's forearm, grounding electricity. "Breathe." They drove in convoy. Lena in the back seat with Arlo, her hand tucked into the car seat handle like she could keep gravity in check through will. Nico at the wheel, performing the ceremonial act of cautious driving like a sacrament. Maya riding shotgun with a list on her phone and her voice low, reading out the things they still needed, anchoring the moment in the practical. At the apartment, the trees on the wall felt less decorative and more prophetic. Lena stepped across the threshold like someone entering a temple with unpracticed reverence. The bassinet waited in the corner, austere and expectant. "Do we put him there?" Lena asked, which was not a question about furniture. "We put him where he can be held by the air without being dropped by it," Maya said gently. "Sometimes that's a bassinet, sometimes that's a chest, sometimes that's the space between a promise and a pause." They wrote Arlo into the room. They tucked him into the bassinet and then immediately took him out again, because his small mouth did something that looked like a protest. They rocked him and sang small, silly songs invented in the moment. They cried when he sneezed because it sounded like a kitten pretending to be a trumpet. They changed a diaper that looked like a cautionary tale. They ate muffins over the sink and spilled coffee and didn't clean it up because love is messy even when you're careful. Around noon, Lena's mother called, voice braced for a fight, and then, when she heard Arlo, unarmed by the sound of a coup that made her forget her scripts. "He sounds like a bird," she said, and Lena cried after they hung up, but not because of her mother. She cried because sound is a form of proof. In the afternoon, the doorbell rang. Nico opened it to find a man whose face looked older than the last time he'd seen it in a photo. Joss, with his shrug that used to look like charm and now looked like someone trying not to be caught by a mirror. He had flowers in a grocery store sleeve and a mouth that already wanted to apologize before it had decided what for. "Don't," Nico said softly, because they had promised themselves no politeness that would poison the room. He stepped outside, let the door close behind him with a whisper. "I heard," Joss said, words hitching. "I wanted to say." "Which version?" Nico asked. "There are many, pick the true one." Joss dragged a hand over his jaw. "Some men are beautiful until the world asks them to do jobs that require more than looking like a poem." He took a breath that looked expensive. I'm a coward, he said. I don't do hard. I thought art would excuse that. It doesn't. That's a better beginning, Nico said. He took the flowers because they were flowers and hadn't done anything wrong. He's not a stage, he's a child. I know, Joss whispered, and it sounded like he had only learned it recently. I won't come in. I don't get to come in. He swallowed hard. Tell Lena I hope she discovers the part of herself that doesn't need me to be a story she can't stop telling. Nico nodded. Tell yourself that, he said. And then do the work where no one can see you. Joss nodded, and for the first time looked like a man rather than a rumor. Congratulations, he said, and left, because sometimes the right thing to do is nothing with witnesses. Inside, Lena didn't ask who it had been. She looked at the flowers in the sink like a test she didn't need to take anymore. I don't want to be in that room again, she said, aloud, to the kitchen, to the bassinet, to the person she'd been. You're not, Maya said. We locked it, remember? She tapped the notebook on the counter, its spine scuffed like a good companion. And we gave the key to future Lena in case she needs to go in and get her coat. They laughed, relief issuing like steam. Arlo hiccuped as if seconding the motion. The days learned a rhythm. Not a good rhythm, not yet, more like the way a band sounds in a first rehearsal when everyone knows the song in theory and struggles in practice. Night feeds, day naps. A schedule that made time feel like a circle drawn by a sleepy god. They found ways to carve minutes for showers, for crying in the bathroom, because sometimes the body needed to evacuate the feelings without an audience, for quick sandwiches eaten over the sink like teenagers on break. Maya's belly became a moon that could set tides. She moved with that particular combination of power and caution pregnant people wear like armor. She and Lena developed a choreography. One bent to lift Arlo, the other counterbalanced with a hand and a small grunt. One held the baby while the other drank water like hydration was a negotiated treaty. They talked, sometimes about nothing, sometimes about old wounds with the formal respect of archivists labeling fragile documents, sometimes about recipes and lullabies, and whether they would allow screen time before age 2. At night sometimes, when the apartment had finally sighed into quiet, Nico would stand at the window and watch the streetlights paint long looks across the sidewalk. He would think of the first home he'd made with Lena, of doors slammed and apologies wasted and Joss's boots on their mat. He would think of the key on the counter that night, the rain's steady verdict on the roof. He would think of the house he was making now, with Maya's laughter installed in the walls and Arlo's small animal noises stitched into the upholstery of the air. He would think not with bravado but with practicality, I am not who I was. He would say it under his breath like someone checking the locks. He would feel not invincible but equipped. At 2 weeks, they held a small ceremony not because they were religious, but because ritual helps humans put handles on meaning. They invited only a few, the neighbor with the muffins, Maya's grandmother who walked through the door with a cane and a bag of cardamom cookies, Lena's sober friend who had sat with her through the raggedest nights. They lit a candle that had sat in the junk drawer for 3 years and now had a job. They said Arlo's name in 4 voices and promised, out loud in front of witnesses, to keep him safe in ways that didn't require lying. Maya's grandmother, eyes sharp as clothespins, held Arlo and said something in a language older than their arguments. It means, she translated, may your feet always find floors that don't give way. After, when the candles had been pinched and the kitchen smelled like spice and sugar, Lena stood at the sink washing cups and said to Maya without turning around, "Thank you." "For the cups," Maya teased. "For not making me pay for what I did to you," Lena said. "For not demanding a tax at every turn." Maya dried a plate with attention like it was an act of worship. "I collect interest in other currencies," she said. "In watching you choose the hard good, in seeing him safe, in knowing our daughter will learn that love doesn't mean shrinking." Lena nodded. "I used to think love was wanting," she said. "Now I think it might be choosing." "It's both," Maya said. "But choosing without wanting is cold, and wanting without choosing is chaos." They stood shoulder to shoulder like soldiers after a battle they'd won, by refusing to fight in the old way. The window over the sink showed them a version of themselves reflected in late afternoon light that made everything look tender. At 36 weeks, Maya went into labor on a Tuesday because Tuesdays are quietly ambitious. The three of them moved like a practiced crew. The bag had been in the hall for a month. The car keys had finally found their permanent place on the hook. Lena held the elevator door like a bouncer while Nico hustled, the kind of hustling you do when the thing you're carrying is priceless and insists on arriving on its own terms. In the delivery room, a nurse grinned, "Back so soon," and Maya rolled her eyes with affection. Labor is holy and hideous. Maya did it like a warrior praying and cursing in the same breath. Nico held one hand, Lena the other, and there was no room for jealousy, only for breath and the small jokes you make with your teeth clenched. When their daughter arrived, she didn't cry immediately. She blinked like a queen considering whether to accept the invitation of air. Then she made a sound that was more like a declaration than a complaint. Small and perfect and still sticky with arrival, she was placed on Maya's chest, and the world did that quiet expanding it does when new life arrives, the way walls lean back to make room. They named her Noor because light had done so much work in their story already. Noor, whose fingers felt like instructions to be gentle. Noor, who found Nico's heartbeat with her cheek and fell asleep as if she'd found a map. Noor, whose brother's name would make more sense to her in the mouth than on paper. "Hi," Lena whispered to Noor, voice reverent like in libraries. "I'm the kind of aunt who will teach you to swear kindly." "Approved," Maya said, tired and glowing in that raw, regal way birth makes people glow. "As long as you also teach her to apologize like you mean it." "I give master classes now," Lena said. And they all laughed because it felt good to laugh in a room that had heard so much fear get translated into effort. At home, weeks later, after the stacked days and the nights knitted together by half-hour naps, after they learned the rhythm of two small humans casting big shadows, Lena knocked once and let herself in. Not because boundaries had become decorative, but because they had become trust. She carried a box of hand-me-downs from a friend and a pie that looked like it had been baked by a grandmother who believed butter was theology. They ate pie over the sink again because ritual deserves repetition. They took turns telling the stories of the day's small victories, Arlo gripping Nico's finger with decisive entitlement, Noor conducting Maya's speech with her fists, Lena saying no to a call from a number that used to make her stupid. Later, when both babies had consented to sleep like landlords who finally accepted a rent payment, the three adults sat in the living room under the watch of painted trees. The air held that specific peace you only get in houses where everyone is allowed to be weak and still be held. Nico spoke first, because it was his turn. "I used to think love was about being the last one standing," he said. "I see now it's about taking turns sitting down." Maya glanced at the notebook on the table, its rules scuffed with use. "We should add one," she said, pen already midair. "What?" Lena asked, eyes gone soft and a little amused. Maya wrote, then read. "No telling this story in ways that make us look like saints." "Good," Nico said. "We were idiots for long stretches." "And also brave," Lena said, and there it was, that bothness that made their life true. They sat in the quiet that follows true things. The trees on the wall looked like a congregation. From the bedroom, Noor made a sound like a tiny wail. From the bassinet, Arlo answered without waking. Outside, the river moved the way rivers do, without asking permission, without performing, inexorably toward what waits. "Do you regret?" Lena asked, not expected to be soothed, only wanting to see the map of someone else's heart. "Everything I did before I learned better," Nico said. "Nothing since." Maya leaned her head on his shoulder. "There will be more chances to learn," she said. "We didn't finish. We just started well." Lena smiled into her hands the way people do when they are surprised by their own luck. "I can live with that," she said. They turned off the lamp. The room held them. The future, which had once felt like a cliff, felt like a path through woods you wanted to walk if you had good shoes and a friend. Felt like a cliff. Felt like a path through woods you wanted to walk if you had good shoes and a friend.